Okay, this is 4B, my commentary on Jordan Peterson's biblical series. As I mentioned in the last video, I'm breaking them up a little bit. Let me know in the comments section whether you prefer like little 30-minute increments or if you want like 2-hour long commentaries, because I can do it either way, and I'm sure some will be on some side and some of the other. So trying it different ways to see what works best for you. So now Peterson is about to not really get into where he's at. He's 5 minutes in. It's going to be another 50 minutes before he actually talks about Adam and Eve, but here goes.
Speaking Western culture knows these stories. And that's something that's interesting too, that stories can be so foundational that everybody shares them. I mean, you can say the same thing about a fairly large handful of fairy tales as well, or you could at least until recently. But the fact that stories are foundational, I think, also means that they have to be given a kind of, well, even if you don't give them any respect, you have to at least treat them as remarkable curiosities. So why those stories, and why did they stick around, and why does everybody know them? And it's not self-evident by any stretch of the imagination, and you can use explanations. You can use the Freudian explanation. Freud sort of thought that the Judeo-Christian was predicated on the idea that the figure of the father, the familial father, was expanded up into cosmic dimensions so that mankind existed in the same relationship to the cosmic father, let's say, that an infant or a small child existed in relationship to his or her own father. And that's a reasonable critique, I would say, to some degree, but it does, and this was purposeful, it does imply, more than imply in Freud's case, that people who adopt religious belief that has a personified figure as at its apex are essentially acting out the role of dependent children. And you know, I thought about that critique for a long time, and believe me, that's been a powerful critique. One of the best books I ever read, called The Denial of Death by Ernest Becker, I think took that line of argumentation. It developed it as well as any book I've ever seen argue it. Becker tried to bring closure to Freudian psychoanalysis on religion, and he did a pretty wicked job of it. Like, I think the book is seriously flawed and wrong, but it's really a great book. Like, some books are wrong in really good ways, right? They make a powerful, powerful argument. They really take it to its extreme. I think Becker missed the point, and he missed it in the same way that Freud missed Jung's point, and Becker, who wrote this book on the psychoanalysis of religion, never referred to Jung except very briefly in the introduction, and I think that was a major mistake. But Becker took the argument that the hypothesis of God is nothing but an attempt by human beings to recreate a quasi-infantile state of dependency and to be able to rely on an all-knowing father and to thereby recover the comfort, perhaps, that we experienced when we were young and had a hypothetically all-knowing father, for those of us who were lucky to have someone who vaguely resembled that. But the more I thought about that, the more that struck me as quite implausible across time. Charles Taylor, I think it was...
Okay, before he gets into Taylor. So in my last video, I talked about how I think part of the reason Peterson is having the effect he is having on bringing people, on having people become interested in the Bible and in the Christian faith, is because they're mirroring him, they're watching him talk about the Bible in not religious language, but in secular language, in a sense, in a secular way, saying the Bible is the Word of God, because these stories are nuggets of, you know, to use religious language, nuggets of revelation. These stories illuminate life on so many different layers. Now, what has happened in the history of Western civilization is that key influential figures like Freud and Becker, in a sense, following along after, but like Freud, came along and said, no, that's not what the Bible is. We're going to reduce the Bible and the Christian faith to an argument that says, well, Christians are, it's what Jesse Ventura said about Christians a number of years ago. Christians are weak people who need a daddy figure, and so what they do is that they look for, here they have a divine father, and so they go to church to help them feel better. Now, one of the things that you learn about Peterson well, maybe not very quickly, but if you listen to him enough, you'll hear him say again and again, he does not like reductive arguments, which means that if you say, as Freud did in a sense, that all the world is about working out our sexual issues, well, that's really convenient, because now you can reduce all of your adversaries to people who have sex issues. Well, probably a lot of the people in your life do have sex issues. We all do one way or another, but that doesn't encapsulate who they are. And their entire life won't revolve around only sex or merely sex. And so this knock on the Bible that says, as Freud does, in a sense, well, it's, we're just looking for comfort. We go to our Heavenly Father because we're working out our daddy issues. It's kind of like looking at George Lucas and saying, yeah, all of his Star Wars figures have daddy issues. And then, well, okay, yeah, there's a lot of daddy issues in Star Wars, but does that sum up the entire significance of the Star Wars thing? I don't think so. So, and now Peterson's going to talk a little bit about Charles Taylor, who's a vitally important, I think, Canadian philosopher who takes on Freud. C.S. Lewis also took on Freud on this, and I read a number of years ago, I read a good book on it that I was just looking for, but I can't lay my hands on right now. But we'll listen to Charles Taylor.
Charles Taylor wrote an interesting book called I think it was called The Origins of the Modern Self. He's a McGill philosopher, and I wouldn't necessarily call him a friend of classic religion, but it doesn't matter.
I believe that Charles Taylor is a Roman Catholic, but yeah, I get to have that idea because I'm sitting in an office and he's up on stage, and I know what it's like to try to think of things on the fly.
He made a very interesting point about Christianity in particular. He said, if you're going to invent a religion that offered you nothing but infantile comfort, why in the world would you bother with conceptualizing hell? That just seems like an unnecessary detail to add to the whole story, right? If it's all about comfort, why would you hypothesize that the consequence of serious error was eternal torment? That doesn't really sound it isn't the sort of thing that is likely to make you feel comfortable. James Joyce, when he wrote about that, said he had terrible nightmares when he was a child because of the hellfire sermons the Jesuits used to spew forth, let's say, and he wrote down what he remembered of them, and they were pretty hair-raising. I think in James Joyce's book, I think it was Portrait of the Artist of a Young Man, he talked about the Jesuits telling him that hell was like a prison with walls that were 7 miles thick that was always in darkness and consumed by fire, and that the people who were trapped there were continually burnt by this dark fire that gave new light, which also simultaneously rejuvenated their flesh so that it could be burnt off eternally. In case you were wondering how it was going to be burnt off eternally, that's apparently the process.
Boy, those Jesuits, they seem to be able to outstrip the Calvinists in talking about hell, thinking about probably that sermon that many of you read in high school literature, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God by Jonathan Edwards.
It's not easy for me to see that as an infantile wish fulfillment, I'm afraid. Now, you could be a cynic about it, and Elaine Padgels, who wrote a book on the devil, was cynical about it in this manner. She thought that the Christians, so to speak, invented hell as a place to put their enemies. And, yeah, fair enough, but no, that's not accurate, really, although it's convenient to have a place to put your enemies. Charles Taylor did point out, for example, that the modern terror of loss of self, let's say the existential loss of self and loss of meaning, was perhaps roughly paralleled by the medieval terror of hell, in terms of existential intensity. And so hell wasn't merely a place where those people that you didn't care for would end up. It was the place where you were going to go if you didn't walk the line properly. And so I don't think Freud's critique really holds water in the final analysis. And then Marx.
And so again, you've got these classical critics of Christianity, and Peterson is taking time in this lecture about the Bible to engage these critics, and this argument, this observation that Charles Taylor made wasn't, I don't think it was, Charles Taylor didn't think it up. This has been a common rebuttal against Freud, but here you've got this lecturer of psychology from the University of Toronto basically saying, yeah, I think Freud's dismissal of religion is simplistic and unfair.
Marx's critique, of course, was that religion was the opiate of the masses, and he made an argument that was similar to Freud's, although somewhat earlier, and based upon the presupposition that religious beliefs were stories told to the gullible masses in order to keep them pacified and happy while their corporate overlords, for lack of a better purpose, continued to exploit them and weaken them. And, you know, I find the critique of human institutions as driven entirely by power very, let's say, questionable to say the least. And
now this is, again, if you've listened to Peterson, this is a point he makes repeatedly. But notice again the pattern in him of refusing to reduce complex situations down to singular causes. And again, Jonathan Haidt in The Delusion of Rationalism, which is early on, somebody pointed me to that video, which was an excellent video, made a very similar point. And this, just in terms, if you want to grow in wisdom, resist the effort to reduce everything down to one simplistic cause, especially when it comes to individual human beings and human communities. There are almost always multiple causes at play, and the reason, so now we have the motivation question. You might ask, is this reason an example of what I'm telling you not to do? But part of the reason we want to do that is because we need to simplify our world. And so if we can say, well, all Christians are people with daddy issues who are just looking for a heavenly father to give them comfort. In other words, Christianity is something like divine thumb sucking. Yeah, that's a nice way to dismiss Christians. The difficulty you're going to have is if you actually begin to meet Christians and find that some of these Christians aren't this way.
And of course, every human institution is corrupt for one reason or another. And
every human institution is corrupt. That's, all these religious tribes are trying to say, oh, Peterson's one of us. Well, there's a good Calvinist statement.
It's also corrupt specifically by such things as deception and arrogance and the demand for unearned power. And the same thing, of course, can be applied to religious systems, but that doesn't mean that they are in some special way characteristic of those faults. And maybe you think they are, and maybe you can make a case for it, but it's not prima facie, I think that's how you say that, evident that that also is a particularly useful criticism. I don't buy it. I think that's far too cynical. I think that the people who wrote these stories, first of all, what are you going to do? You're going to run a bloody conspiracy for 3,000 years successfully? It's like, good luck with that. You can't run a conspiracy for 15 minutes without somebody ratting you out. It's impossible. So whatever's at the basis of the construction, not only of these stories, but of the dogmatic structures that emerged from them, I think that it's a terrible mistake to reduce them to unidimensional explanations. In fact, I generally think that reducing any complex human behavior to a unidimensional explanation is often the sign of a seriously limited thinker. And I say that with some caution because Freud did do that with religion, at least to some degree, and Freud was a serious thinker, and Marx, I suppose, was a serious thinker too, even though, well...
The man does not like Marx.
Yeah, he's someone if you have any sense, Marx just leaves you speechless. So anyway, so that's all to say that I don't think there's any simple explanation for how these stories have the power that they have. I really don't. I don't think you can reduce it to political conspiracy, that's for sure. I don't think you can reduce it to psychological infantilism. I think you can make a case, like I have, that they are repositories of the collective wisdom of the human race. I had an interesting letter this week.
Wisdom is an important word for Peterson. And, when as I continue with my project and as we dig deeper into him, we're going to revisit this word wisdom again and again and come to terms with the metaphysical implications that the word itself has in terms of how it interacts with what Peterson calls being. Now, I know that sounds terribly esoteric, but in time, hopefully we'll get there.
This week from someone, I get a lot of interesting letters. I think I'm going to make an archive out of them and put them.
I've been getting a lot of interesting letters too, and I really like them. So, unfortunately, I mentioned to somebody today in email, I said, in some sense, Peterson got strapped onto a rocket and status-wise has been heading up into the stratosphere. Now, we don't know where he's going to land or what he's going to hit or what's going to happen to him. But, that just gives him floods of letters. And I've gotten, my tiny little YouTube channel, I've gotten, a bunch of new Facebook friends and letters and emails from people. And it has been so much fun because this world is big and huge. The book of Isaiah says that when the Lord shows up in the temple, to Isaiah's terror, because every time the Lord shows up, that's exactly what happens to people. It's terror, and people cry out, "Make him stop." So when the Lord shows up in the temple in Isaiah, to his terror, and then the angels that have 2 wings covering their face, 2 wings covering their feet. This is a very interesting thing. I'd love to see Peterson pull that one apart. Or Jonathan Pajot. I've really been enjoying his channel. But the angels cry out, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty," which means holy, holy, holy in Hebrew terms. He is so far and distant and exalted and beyond anything we can imagine. So that's the first line. Hebrew poetry has couplets. The second line, the whole earth is filled with his glory. And I see that in the letters I get from people. That some letters have tremendous amount of pain in them, but yet there's glory in them. And that's... Okay, back to Peterson talking about his letters. He's got way more than I get.
I'm on the web at some point, with people's permission, obviously. And he said that he'd been following my lectures and noted that I had been making what you might describe as a quasi-biological or evolutionary case for the emergence of the information that the stories contain. And he said, well, how do you know that someone from a different religious tradition or speaking of a different religious tradition couldn't do exactly the same thing? And I thought, well, first of all, to some degree they could, because there is overlap. Like I've talked to you a little bit about Taoism, for example, in the Taoist view of being as, the eternal balance between chaos and order. One thing I didn't tell you, I don't think about that, and I don't know if you know this, but there's a neuropsychologist named Elkonin Goldberg who was a student of Alexander Luria, and Luria was, I think, the greatest neuropsychologist of the 20th century. He was a Russian, and he was one of the first people to really determine, in large part, the function of the frontal cortex, which was quite a mystery for a very long period of time. And Goldberg, you know how we have 2 hemispheres, right? We have a left hemisphere.
He has just interrupted his story 4 times. I have a theory about this. You know how we're all supposed to have short attention spans, again, because of television? And then we wonder, well, how can we watch 2 hours of Peterson with our short attention spans? It's because he interrupts himself every 30 seconds and starts in a new story. So it's like squirrel, 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 squirrel. And it's all such interesting stuff, so we keep watching.
Hemisphere and a right hemisphere, and people often think of the left for right-handed people, right-handed males more particularly, because women are more neurologically diffuse. It's one of the things that makes them more robust to head injury, for example. And maybe men are less diffuse and somewhat more specialized, which makes them a bit more specialized, but a little more subject to damage. Anyways, we have 2 hemispheres, the left and the right, and no one exactly knows why. And we know that they house quasi-independent consciousnesses, because if you divide the corpus callosum that unites them, which was done in cases of intractable epilepsy, for example, that each hemisphere is capable of developing its own consciousness to some degree, the right generally nonverbal and the left verbal. And so there has been this idea that the left is a verbal hemisphere and the right is a nonverbal hemisphere. But that can't be right, because of course animals don't talk and they have a bifurcated hemisphere. So if it's right, it's not causally right. Now Goldberg hypothesized instead that the hemispheres were We're specialized for routinization and non-routinization, or for novelty and familiarity, or for chaos and order.
Now I hadn't listened to this video for a little while, and then in preparation for this, I was listening to it, and I was thinking, well, that's pretty convenient. Chaos and order. And I think, in all fairness, yeah, routinization and not routinization, that which is routine and that which is novel. Chaos and order, those really tie, kind of. I see your point. But you just have a book with chaos and order. And I, again, the more, I think part of the reason Peterson is so popular and it's working so well is that these representations by these words that we have of chaos and order, this stuff is scalable. And I find, I've mentioned this in other places, pastorally, this is really helpful. And I was having a conversation with a denominational official from my denomination this morning, and we were just having a friendly conversation, and I was listening to him describe, stuff in his work, and I was thinking about, our Christian Reformed denomination and all the issues that it has, and again, it's like chaos and order. It's like, too much order, and you stultify chaos. Too much closeness, too much openness, and then then you have too much chaos comes in and things fall apart. And so it's always getting those balances right. It's always getting those tensions right, and so to think that this connects up with our brain stands to reason.
And so that's pretty damn cool. When I ran across that, I also thought about that as a signal of what would you call it? Multi-method, multi-trait construct validation, because I'd never thought of the hemispheres as operating that way, and Goldberg came up with this in a historical pathway that was entirely independent from any mythologically inspired thinking, completely independent. In fact, it was motivated more by materialist Russian neuropsychology, which was materialist for political reasons and also for scientific reasons. But the idea is that we have one hemisphere that reacts very rapidly to things we don't know, and it's more imaginative and diffuse, and it's associated more with negative emotion, because negative emotion is what you should feel immediately when you encounter something you don't understand. Because it's a form of thinking, right? Negative emotion, it's like, I'm somewhere where things aren't what they should be. The right hemisphere does that, generates images very rapidly to help you figure out what might be there. And then the left hemisphere takes that and develops it into something that's more articulated and algorithmic and fully understood. And so then there's this dynamic balance between the right and the left hemisphere, where the left tries to impose order on the world. That's Ramachandran, who's a neurologist in California, a very famous neurologist, who also developed a theory like Goldberg's, who said that the left hemisphere imposes routinized order on the world, and the right hemisphere generates novelty and reacts to novelty and generates novel hypotheses. And he thought, and there is some good evidence for this, that's what's happening during the dream is that information has moved from the right hemisphere to the left hemisphere in small doses, basically, so that the novel revelations of the right hemisphere don't demolish the algorithmic structures that the left hemisphere has so carefully put together. So,
and again, boy, have I learned a ton watching these videos about stuff like this, and I didn't know hardly anything about stuff like this. I've read some brain books and so on and so forth, but so as part of what I've been doing with this, and I started reading Jung's autobiography, and some of what I've learned, when I talk about my Jungian great cloud of witnesses and, these little sub Paul Vanderklays in the back of my head, and then talking about, okay, the divided brain here, learning some of this stuff, it has been tremendously practical for me, and it's opened up new vistas. And so, I'm really indebted to this guy for these lectures and all of his little detours, because I've learned a lot along the way, and it's really, I think, helped me up my resolution on human beings and how we are and how we work, and I think that's a really cool thing. Still haven't talked about the Bible.
Because it also does help justify the hypothesis that I've been laying out for you, which is that You know, there's part of us that extends ourselves out into the world and tries to understand what we don't know. And that part extends itself out with behavior and also with emotion and also with image and then maybe with poetry.
And I think the image part is important too, because, you know, one of the things, just as listening to him now, because every time I listen to these things, I pick up new things and I'm able to incorporate them. You know, why are our dreams images? Well, that's a really interesting question. And why do we have to process our dreams as images? Why does our brain need to process our dreams as images? And what implication does that have in terms of this entire narrative that he's creating in terms of where revelation comes from? Now I want to be careful here, because I know some of you who are really monitoring the naturalist, supernaturalist frontier are going to hear that and say, oh, you know, Vanderklay's going over to the other side. No, I'm still supernaturalist, and when I get around to, and I know a bunch of you are still waiting, when I get around to C.S. Lewis's Miracles, I am going to do it. When I get around to C.S. Lewis's Miracles, this is exactly what we're going to focus on, this frontier. And I think what part of what Peterson does, not as well as I think he could, but part of what Peterson does, which kind of opens up the Bible to a lot of people who have been closed to it, is he says, now this line between natural and supernatural, it's a border that's kind of like this. You might say, well, I'm uncomfortable with that. Well, yeah. The world is not a safe space, and the Bible is not a safe book, and the church is not a safe space, and God is not safe in any way if you believe that God is anything like the God of the Bible. He is not safe at all. And C.S. Lewis makes this point with Aslan. Aslan is a good lion, but Aslan is not a tame lion, and Aslan is not safe. And so when you're in the presence of this God, you had better keep your wits about you. So back to Peterson.
Poetry, and then maybe with storytelling, and then as that develops, then we develop more and more articulated representations of that emergent knowledge, and so you can map that quite nicely onto the neurologists and the neuropsychologists' presumption about what constitutes the reason for the hemispheric differentiation. But the other thing that's so cool about the hemispheric differentiation argument, as far as I'm concerned, and this is,
are we going to talk about the Bible?
About, man, because it's a real
Here I'm being a heckler.
Word that Ned Flanders uses for that. Noggin scratcher? I think it's something like that.
Anyways, and I love the Simpsons
we do make
interjections.
The assumption that what it is that we are biologically adapted to is reality, right? It's actually an axiomatic definition, if you're a Darwinian, because nature is what's select.
If you're a Darwinian, now this is vitally important against, if you watch Transliminal 2015, his categorizations of contemporary skeptics and atheists into Newtonians and Darwinians, I don't fully understand that, but there's something there. There's something important, and it's something foundational for understanding how Peterson is different from, let's say, Sam Harris.
By definition, that's what nature is. It's what selects.
And as a Calvinist, and we're going to get into this again in C.S. Lewis, nature is what selects. As a Calvinist, God is what chooses. So what's the relationship between God and nature? And C.S. Lewis is very much going to get into the question of what is the relationship between reason and nature and God.
And if the nature that selects has forced upon you a dual hemispheric structure because half of you has to deal with chaos and half of you has to deal with order, then you can make a pretty damn strong inferential case that the world is made out of chaos and order. And that's really something to think about, man, you know. So you can think about that for a while if you want.
Okay, take a moment and think about it. And part of what's so fun about Peterson is he's just a fun personality. He's just fun to watch with his Kermit-like voice and his little detours here and there. I just get a kick out of watching him.
So,
now we're back to the same slide.
A lot packed into these stories, and so let's investigate a couple more of them. We'll start with this story of Adam.
And now I'm at 30 minutes again, and we're back to the same slide. So I'm going to pause it, and we're going to regroup, and we're going to start again.